This evening, I want to put on my professor hat for a moment with you and ask you to reflect with me a little more deeply about where we find ourselves today in this country as we continue to deal with that, if I may say, gift that none of us wants that keeps on giving, the gift of racism. And ask the question, what's going on? Why is it that we seem to be as far away from this myth of a post-racial society than we have ever been before, notwithstanding the progress we have made? And so I'm going to ask that you reflect with me for a while this evening as I have been asked to give my thoughts to you on how we got to this place and precisely what's going on in this country so that perhaps we can find our way out of this cycle of sin. Black Lives Matter. This was the hashtag that Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tibet created as, in their words, a call to action for black people after 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was posthumously placed on trial for his own murder, and the killer was not held accountable for the crime he committed. End quote. As the Black Lives Matter hashtag went viral across social media and eventually moved from social media into the streets, one thing became abundantly clear. It was more than just a slogan. It was a symbol. For, as theologian Paul Tillich would say of symbols, it unlocked dimensions of the soul. In this regard, it unlocked dimensions of the black soul in America. The Black Lives Matter hashtag tapped into the collective soul of black women and men as they were once again confronted with the reality of how dangerous a world this was for their sons and daughters. For to be sure, after the July 13th, 2013 not guilty verdict of Trayvon's killer, black people wondered if the world, if this country, would ever be a safe place for their children. When the judge read the verdict, Black America was once again confronted with the harsh reality that black life in America was virtually unprotected, if not dispensable. The decision regarding Trayvon's killer was the 21st century version of the 1857 Dred Scott decision, that at any given moment in time, black people have, as the decision read, no rights that the white man is bound to respect. As hurt, disbelief, anger, confusion, and fear were profound within black households in the various gathering spaces of black people in America, the question was being asked, even if it was not directly spoken, it was being asked, did black lives matter in America? For after Trayvon, there was Jordan, then Renisha, then Jonathan and Eric and Rakia and Michael and James and Tamir and Freddie and Sandra and Laquan, and the list can go on. The answer seemed clear. Black lives didn't matter. But why? Was it simply about a few bad, bigoted police? Was it simply that there was some white people who did not like black people? Or was it something more? Something more about America itself? As young black men and women continue to be murdered at the hands of white people with seeming impunity, my mind went back to the question that I asked my father more than 50 years earlier. Yes, at 6 or 7 years old, growing up in Dayton, Ohio, I heard the whispers of the adults around me talking about how awful it was that the church was bombed and those 4 little girls were killed. I can remember hearing someone say that the white man who did it will probably never be caught, and if he were to be caught, nothing was likely to happen to him. Around that same time in my childhood, I remember seeing pictures on the news of white policemen with dogs attacking black people. What struck me most were the dogs were attacking black children. I didn't know what I was watching, but those images were seared into my mind, perhaps contributing to my fear of dogs today. I also remember eavesdropping as my parents talked about a man in Mississippi who was killed in his driveway in front of his family, and what a shame it was, and again, how nothing would probably happen to whoever did it if they ever found him. It was no doubt these whispered conversations and violent images in my mind, along with my growing awareness of what it meant to be black in America, that prompted me at the age of 7 or so to ask my father why white people didn't like us. I don't remember his answer, but I do remember thinking that if I could figure it out, then maybe we could do something about it, and then perhaps white people would stop treating us so badly. For in my mind, I just knew that it was something that we must have done to warrant such treatment. I can't remember how much time had passed before I figured out the answer, whether it was weeks or months. But what I do remember, as if it was yesterday, that I picked the conversation back up with my father. One afternoon, as we were leaving the house, I stopped on the porch and I said, "Daddy, I figured out the answer to my question," as if he and I were having this continuous conversation. He asked, "The answer to what question?" I said, "To what we did that made white people not like us and treat us so badly." He said, "Oh, what did you figure out?" I said that we didn't do anything. They just treat us like this because they want to. It could be the Indians, I said, or the Chinese. It just happens to be us. Little did I know at the time that it wasn't just us, and that it was more than simply whether or not white people liked us. For here we are, some 50 years later, with the same question of why. Why, in an era of a black president, do the bodies and lives of black people, especially young black males, seem to be in as much jeopardy as they have ever been in our nation's history? Why does it seem that black lives do not really matter? Some 50 years or so ago, in response to President Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "While the question who killed President Kennedy is important, the question, what killed him, is more important." Martin King's words were instructive in answering the question of why then, as they are instructive for us today. For in order to answer the question of why black lives seem not to matter, we must first understand what is killing the Trayvons and the Renishas and the Erics of our world. And so, with the time before me, let me try to answer what killed Trayvon by looking at what I believe we should and can do about it. What killed Trayvon? While the answer to this question certainly involves the Stand Your Ground law, which was a backdrop to the Trayvon Martin case, it goes beyond this law. The Stand Your Ground law is an extension of the English common law that gives a person the right to protect his or her castle. Stand your ground essentially broadens the notion of the castle to include one's body. It permits certain individuals to protect their embodied castle whenever and wherever they feel threatened. In this regard, a person does not have to retreat from the place in which he or she is castled. They can stand their ground. Essentially, a person's body is his or her castle. While this law was initially invoked as a reason for Trayvon's slaying, it was not used, as you know, as a formal defense. Nevertheless, Stand Your Ground law signals a social cultural climate that makes the destruction and death of black bodies inevitable and even permissible. A Stand Your Ground culture has produced and sustained slavery, black codes, Jim Crow, lynching, and other forms of racialized violence on black bodies. This very culture also sustains the prison industrial complex, which thrives on black bodies, male and female. Most disturbing, this stand-your-ground culture seems only to have intensified during this time of a black president, as it continues to take young black lives. So, what's going on? The answer to this begins with a recognition of the grand narrative of this country, which has sustained a stand-your-ground culture and the religious canopies that have legitimated it. Because I cannot fully at this time cover the complex and interlocking web and systems of this narrative, and that this narrative has spawned, along with its caricatures and stereotypes grafted onto black bodies. I will focus primarily on how the black body has been constructed as a criminal body, thus rendering it always guilty of something, making aggressive and fatal violence against black bodies acceptable. You with me? The making of the criminal, guilty black body began with the arrival of the first Americans to this soil, Pilgrims and Puritans alike. In 98 CE, Roman historian Tacitus published what has been called one of the most dangerous books ever written, the Germania. Perhaps it is. In a brief space of 30 pages, he offered an ethnological perspective that would have tragic consequences for centuries to come. It is the racial specter behind what I call stand-your-ground culture. Germania provides a meticulous portrait of, as he says, an aboriginal people who are, he says, free from all taint of intermarriages, with, he describes, fierce blue eyes, red hair, huge frames, who possess, he said, good moral habits, a peculiar respect for individual rights, and an almost instinctive love for freedom. Tacitus' ethnological description spawned the construction of the Anglo-Saxon myth. This myth has been a ubiquitous, even if unspoken and unacknowledged, ideology in the modern world. Initially, this myth highlighted Anglo-Saxon forms of government and stressed the unique superiority of Anglo-Saxon religious and political institutions. Eventually, and perhaps inevitably, the myth shifted its focus to Anglo-Saxon blood. In so doing, it suggested that the superiority of the institutions was a result of Anglo-Saxon blood. It argued that strong moral qualities and high regard for freedom flowed uniquely through Anglo-Saxon veins. This myth, replete with reverence for Tacitus, arrived in America by way of England's post-Reformation struggles with the Puritans and Pilgrims as they fled from the Church of England to build a nation more befitting, they believed, Anglo-Saxon virtue and freedom. They considered themselves the Anglo-Saxon remnant that was continuing a divine mission. They traced this mission beyond the woods of Tacitus' Germans to the Israelites in the Bible. They carried their Anglo-Saxon heritage across the Atlantic Ocean with a self-righteous pride. From its earliest beginnings, therefore, America's social political identity with a legitimating religious canopy was an Anglo-Saxon identity. Its sense of democracy and freedom was inextricably linked to the Anglo-Saxon myth and Tacitus' Germans. This was a myth that greatly shaped the father of America's democracy, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, make no mistake about it, was a thoroughgoing and unapologetic Anglo-Saxonist, to the point of studying Anglo-Saxon language and grammar and insisting that it be taught in the university, and considering Tacitus' Germania one of the greatest books ever written. The point of the matter is that through the architects of America's democracy, such as Thomas Jefferson, America's democracy was conceived as an expression of Anglo-Saxon character. The city on the hill that the early Americans were building was nothing less than a testament to Anglo-Saxon chauvinism. Hence, the grand narrative that defines America is that of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. In order to sustain itself, this narrative then produced the ideology of white supremacy, what W.E.B. Du Bois describes as the wages of whiteness, or legal scholar Cheryl Harris calls cherished white property. Subsequently, in an effort to validate the reality of cherished white property, which expresses itself as subjugating power endowed with rights that only white bodies can enjoy, such as the right to stand one's ground, knowledge was willed to foster the ideology of an innate ontological difference between black people and white people. In fact, various discourses were generated that cast the black body as a kind of beastly creation. Indeed, stand your ground culture emerged part and parcel with the ideology of white supremacy in an effort to protect white space. Again, that is the free space, and hence, wherever the white body is castled. Simply put, from its Puritan and Pilgrim beginnings, Anglo-Saxon power has formed an intricate web of interactive narratives and discourse to sustain itself, or at least to maintain the illusion of America's Anglo-Saxon identity. The black body has become trapped in this web that ultimately constructs it as a criminal body, always guilty of something. Perhaps not surprising, this construct of the criminal black body has its roots in slavery. The black body as chattel gives the specter from slavery that has the greatest impact upon black people's current social cultural realities. It was firmly established within America's collective consciousness during slavery, and it remains a pervasive part of that consciousness today. This construct is a valuable part of America's exceptionalist identity. Thus, it is not easily disposed of. As Michelle Alexander, who many of you would know as the author of The New Jim Crow, has aptly pointed out, racism is highly adaptable. So too are the constructs that have fostered it. They just take different forms, those that are appropriate to the social historical context. It is what one scholar called preservation through transformation. Now, oftentimes, the transformations effectively mask the racialized character of the new construct. You with me? Such is the case with the transformation of the black body as chattel. The 21st century version of this construct is the criminal black body. The black body that was once marked as chattel is now marked as criminal. This construct serves the same purpose as the construct of chattel. It relegates the black body to an unfree space. It preserves the free space as a white space. Now, how did this transformation begin? It began shortly after emancipation. W.E.B. Du Bois says that the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved again toward slavery. What Du Bois is referring to, of course, is the brief period of Reconstruction. During this period, black people began to enjoy some of the rights that were considered, as he says, wages of whiteness. For instance, they were able to vote and run for political office. In fact, as we know, black men were elected to the United States Senate and the House of Representatives during that period. However, the image of the black person as chattel still lurked in the imagination of American society. The fear of black people that consumed white people after emancipation was driven by the belief that black people no longer acted as chattel. There was a longing expressed for the, as they said, old Negro. Essentially, there was an urgency to reinscribe black people with their identity as chattel, hence to return them to the space for which they had allegedly been created. It is, of course, not by chance that the stand-your-ground culture, which was fostered to protect cherished white property, and hence the white space, began to assert itself in a more aggressive manner after emancipation, because this was the first time that white America had to deal with a population of free black bodies. Even Alexis de Tocqueville recognized during his 19th century travels across the United States that, as he said, the prejudice that repels Negroes seems to grow as Negroes cease to be slaves. The assertion of stand-your-ground culture effectively removed the black body from the white space by criminalizing it after emancipation. The various assertions of Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction stand-your-ground culture, such as Jim Crow, black codes, Jim Crow laws, and lynching, served to transform the construct of chattel into criminal. Black codes and Jim Crow laws in particular served to plant the image of the black body as a criminal body deep within America's collective consciousness. Du Bois pays particular attention to these laws in his classic essay on Black Reconstruction. He calls these laws, quote, the most oppressive laws of the period, designed, he said, to fit the Negro's condition and to be enforced, particularly in regard to Negroes. An example of one such law is the Georgia law. The Georgia law, in part, stipulated this, and I'll read a part of it for you. All persons, it said, wandering or strolling about in idleness, who are able to work and who have no property to support them, who are able to work but don't work, and who have no property to support them, all persons leading an idle, immoral, or profligate life, who have no property to support them and still don't work, all persons able to work having no visible and no means of a fair, honest, and acceptable livelihood, those persons shall be deemed and considered vagrants and shall be indicted as such. End of law. Now, even though many of these vagrancy laws did not mention race, it is clear that black people were the targets of them. The chance of a black person gaining steady employment right after emancipation was next to none. Again, the black body did not enjoy the right to his or her own labor. This did not significantly change after slavery, meaning they could not expect to acquire a paid job. If they managed to do so, the pay was certainly not sufficient to, as the law said, support themselves. Therefore, it is clear, as Du Bois said, that the vagrancy laws were written to fit the Negro's condition. They were meant to ensnare them in a criminal cycle. Consequently, a new chattel identity was constructed. These laws literally made a criminal of black people. Essentially, these laws penalized black people for living while black by placing them in jail or relegating them to forced labor. Again, the very conditions of black living, that is, not having a stable job, home, being a vagrant, were made illegal. It is in this way that blackness became a marker for criminality. The black body itself was effectively criminalized. And like chattel, a criminal does not belong in free space. This construct of the criminal black body has been sustained in the 20th and 21st century the way it was sustained in post-emancipation America, through the racially biased laws of stand-your-ground culture, such as drug laws, stop and frisk, and the stand-your-ground law itself. One researcher put it this way: so ubiquitous is the pattern of discriminatory law enforcement that the effect has been to criminalize an entire black population. Indeed, most recently, a close aide you may have read to President Nixon, John Ehrlichman, said in the New York Daily News this: we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs, Ehrlichman said? Of course we did. End quote. Michelle Alexander has called the prison industrial complex the new Jim Crow. She is right in the sense that it does, as she says, function as a well-designed system of racialized social control in a manner strikingly similar, she says, to Jim Crow. The laws that have been generated to ensure a majority black and prison population certainly are updated versions of Jim Crow laws. Nevertheless, the prison industrial complex is about more than the Jim Crow laws that make it work. This complex attempts to reinstall in a more acceptable 21st century manner the same system that Jim Crow was developed to reinstall, slavery. The prison industrial complex returns the black body back to its proper place. It virtually re-enslaves the black body by putting it behind bars. If the black criminal is the new chattel, the prison industrial complex is the new slaveocracy. The prison industrial complex is the institutionalized manifestation of stand your ground culture. With prisons and jails serving as the new plantations, cherished white property is protected, and the most dangerous black body of all, that is the black male body, is adequately patrolled and controlled. What makes the transformation complete is the insinuation of the image of the black criminal, black body as criminal, into the American collective consciousness. While the scientific and religious community provided the evidence to sustain the notion of the black body as chattel during the 19th century, today, the mass news media has provided evidence to sustain the black body as criminal. The news media has all but taken up the mantle of phrenology, physiognomy, and religious racism and other alleged evidentiary sciences and religion. It has become the progenitors of scientific racism. It is subtly but firmly implanted within the American mind the notion that criminals are black and blacks are criminals. Many scholars and researchers have reached a similar conclusion after studying the news media's coverage of crime. They have variously concluded, and I will quote, as a result of the overwhelming media focus on crime, drug use, gang violence, and other forms of antisocial behavior among African Americans, the media have fostered a distorted and public perception of African Americans. Moreover, there are numerous studies that reveal almost automatic, unwitting responses to black bodies, as if those bodies were threatening or criminal in and of themselves. Alexander concludes that blackness and crime has become so conflated in the public consciousness, she says, that the construct of the criminal black man is an inevitable reality. To see a black male body is to see a criminal body. As sociologist Victor Rios has rightly noted, this applies as well to brown bodies, that is, Latino males. And so, as he says, one criminalizes those males long before they ever do anything criminal. And thus, it was impossible, you see, for the white police officer in Cleveland to see Tamir Rice against a 12-year-old child that he was. He was, to him, a threatening criminal man. Now, it's interesting to know, by the way, that Ohio, my home state, has an open carry law, meaning it's legal to carry a gun in public. So here's the thing. Even if the officer thought Tamir was 21, he had a right to carry a gun. What is clear, however, is that that right to carry a gun is a wage of whiteness. It should be noted that the black female body has been criminalized as well, perhaps in a more gender-specific way. She is often portrayed as criminally immoral and most times mean and angry. It is the case that black women are incarcerated at a rate 3 to 4 times higher than their white counterpart. It is no accident as well, it seems to me, that the image of a black mother that continuously looped during last year's uprising in Baltimore was that of a black mother hitting her son as she reprimanded him for being a part of the uprising. The point of the matter is that black women are portrayed as angry and threatening, as young black women they're portrayed as what Dr. Rios calls the violent girl. And hence, a Sandra Bland becomes threatening. The transformation from chattel to criminal is complete. The free black body is viewed as a clear and present danger to cherished white property. It is a body that needs to be kept from roaming freely about society. It needs to be controlled. This is a criminal body. It is an unalterably guilty body. And indeed, free black bodies are guilty of something. And in fact, according to the web of discourse and knowledge spun by America's grand narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, they are guilty of trespassing into the white space. Practically speaking, and as we have seen, a free black body does not enjoy the presumption of innocence. It must always be guilty. Hence, black murder victims are the ones put on trial, because not only are they criminal and violent, but they've transgressed white space. That is the space where a white body was castled. What killed the Trayvons and continues to kill our black children? American exceptionalism's constructed reality of black guilt killed them. They were free bodies in a white space. They were guilty of a crime. It was a white space because white people occupied it. They had to be doing something other than asking for help, or walking home, or playing loud music. The discursive production of America's narrative of exceptionalism has done its job, as it takes the freedom and indeed the lives of young black women and men with impunity. Whiteness has effectively stood its ground. And so it is that in a stand-your-ground culture, black lives do not matter, at least not when they are seen to be a threat to the wages of whiteness. And so it was inevitable that as the Black Lives Matters hashtag went viral, whiteness would stand its ground with the refrain, all lives matter. My son was about 2 years old. I had taken him to the park to play in a Flintstone-like car that was on the park's playground. This particular park was next door to an elementary school. After being in the park for about 15 minutes, what appeared to be a class of first graders recessed into it. Two little boys, one blonde-haired, the other red-headed, ran down to the car where my son was playing. Seeing them coming, my 2-year-old son immediately jumped out. Soon, the two little boys began fighting over who was going to play in the car. My son looked on with all of the fascination of a 2-year-old. The little red-headed boy, who seemed to be winning the battle for the car, saw my son looking on. He suddenly stopped fighting for the car and turned toward my son. With all the venom that a 7 or 8-year-old boy could muster, he pointed his finger at my son and he said, "You better stop looking at us before I put you in jail where you belong." This little boy was angry. My son had intruded upon his space. My son was guilty of being black in the park and looking. I was horrified. Before I could say anything to the offending boy, the white teacher who was in earshot approached. She clearly heard what the little boy said to my son. I expected her to admonish the little boy and to make him apologize. Instead, she looked at my 2-year-old son as if he were the perpetrator of some crime and said to the little boys, "Come on with me before there is trouble." At that moment, I was seething with anger. I took my son and left the park. As I was driving home, tears flowed from my eyes. I felt an unspeakable pain and sadness. At 2 years old, my son was already viewed as a criminal. At 7 or 8 years old, the link between a black body and a criminal body had already been forged in the mind of a little white boy. If at 2 years old my son was regarded as guilty of something by the white teacher, I feared what his future would bring as he got older. If at 2, looking like a guilty criminal, got a finger pointed in his face and a teacher hustling kids off to safety, what will the response be to him now that he's a proud 6', 23-year-old man? Unfortunately, I know that response. And so what does this mean? What are we to do about it? While tomorrow morning I will say a little bit more about the meaning of God's justice, let me point out a couple of things that I think we should and do and can do about it as people of faith, as a church. What can we do? We first must recognize that these systems and structures that are the fruit of stand-your-ground culture are sin. They limit employment, housing, educational, healthcare, and even recreational opportunities for non-white bodies. And in all their sinfulness, they are violent. They are crucifying realities that do harm to bodies and limit, if not destroy, life possibilities. Stand-your-ground culture produces violent systems and structures. It fosters conditions of living that nurture death, not life. And so it is no wonder that we see disproportionately higher rates of crime and homicide in certain communities, amongst black males, for instance. For this is the violence that violence has produced. As people of God, we must stop the violence at its source and demand a change in these inequitable systems and structures. Because for now, they are doing their job. They are destroying non-white lives. To do anything less is to be complicit with those who shout, "Crucify him, crucify him." At the same time, we must work to provide the resources of support, both material and non-material, for those who are trapped in these conclaves of death, like poverty, so that they are able not only to survive with dignity, but to thrive. But then there's another level of response. I do believe that real change starts from the bottom up. Hence, we must change the web of relationships of power from below in order to change power relationships from above. As I often say, unjust, dominating power trickles down. Real change radiates up. Thus, churches and communities of faith must lead the way in changing those relationships by having the difficult conversations about race and all that it means in this nation. As I come to an end, let me share another story. After the decision not to indict the officer involved in Tamir's killing, along with the decision to hold no one accountable for Sandra Bland's death, after both of those decisions were announced in December, my son came to me and asked what I thought about it. I asked him what he thought. He said that he wasn't surprised, and he just figures that this is the way it is, and black people just have to get used to it and try not to put themselves in situations where policemen can kill them. He went on to say that he could not imagine a scenario where he would call a police officer to try to help him. Needless to say, my son and I engaged further in conversation about this matter of race and racism in America. After which, it led me to ask this: what are the conversations that white parents are having with their children? Black parents and children cannot avoid the conversation of race. Not to have that conversation is a wage of whiteness. One thing I do know: if things are going to change, then white parents must have the conversation of race with their children. And again, the church and communities of faith can and indeed must help with that. I have come to believe that this time of ours is a Kairos time. That is, as you know, a decisive moment in history that potentially has far-reaching impact. A time where through chaos and crisis, God is fully present, disrupting things as they are, so to provide an opening to a new way of being in the world, a new way of being with one another, and even a new way of being with God. What can we do? We can lead the way to that new way of being so that there will be no doubt that Black lives really do matter.